way of Will John.
Guys, what's up? We have, of course, a very special guest who I will introduce, Morgan Wright, who is an internationally recognized expert on cybersecurity strategy, cyber terrorism, identity theft, and privacy. He's done a whole lot more than that. In addition to 18 years as a state trooper, he was a highly decorated state trooper and detective. He's developed solutions in defense, to justice, intelligence for the largest technology companies in the world, including Cisco, 𝗪𝗪𝗡, Bell Labs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got a lot to get into. Morgan, thank you a whole bunch for being here. How's it going?
Hey, it's like old home week. We were talking right before we got started. You're the Overland Park area, Kansas City. I tell you, as a kid, as a youth, we went up and watched the Kansas City Royals play the New York Yankees at the old, and they were staying at the old Muehlebach Hotel downtown before it was, I think, torn down. Went to one of the very last games at Royal Stadium. Ewing Kauffman owned it at the time before they tore it down. So I used to have Thurman Munson's autograph, and I lost it during a move. I had it in a book. So it's like, used to go up to Kansas City all the time. That Overland Park area is so much fun.
Oh, it's tons of fun. And, I spent that whole COVID time, like last year, it was the longest I'd been away from home. I'm playing soccer over here in Europe, and I always go home in my breaks. COVID hit, and I was gone for like a year and a half. So it was good to be back, But to get straight into it, you've done so much cool stuff. Tons of things that I think people are going to be very interested in, and a lot of topics that we touch on sometimes in these podcasts, but we've never had somebody of your status
please.
to be able to.
I'm a little Kansas farm boy. A little Kansas farm boy.
We have that thing, huh? We have that thing in Kansas, huh?
Yeah.
Where we just say we're just a little Kansas doing great things. No, you're doing great things, and I find it very interesting. So why don't you just give just a little bit of background as well onto how and who, like when people hear the word cyber security, cyber terrorism, identity theft, what do you do specifically? What have you done? And then we'll get into some more details.
Sure. I actually got into it by accident because I was a lazy trooper. No, not lazy in that sense, but we used to have so many of these complex formulas. I used to do a lot of accident reconstruction. So I got tired of doing everything by hand. So I got my first computer was a Tandy 1000, SX, I think it was, the old DOS days. And I wrote some programs so that I could do these calculations faster. Well, one thing led to another. I stayed involved in technology, in investigations. I started doing computer crime, but I always loved the human element part of it because I used to specialize in interview and interrogation. Went through the original training that the FBI gave to state and local law enforcement for serial crime profiling. So I went through with one of the original members of the FBI's behavioral science unit, a guy named William T. Peters. Just fascinating stuff. So there's always been this intersection of people and technology. You can't have tech without people. And in this day and age, you can't have people without tech. So it's that perfect kind of confluence. But, through my course of my career, I ended up getting the opportunity to come out here to Virginia, which is where I'm at now. Did a lot of work in the intelligence community, the justice community, DOD stuff. I was working in Plan Colombia down in Bogota. Just beautiful country. They were dealing with a lot of stuff, but after 9/11, everything changed. Our mission focus changed. The things I worked on changed. But one thing became very important, which was the ability to defend our critical infrastructure, the ability to defend our networks. And we were finding is that here, let me put it by saying this is the way I've always focused on things. So it's one statement: the problem isn't the problem, and the problem isn't even the way we think about the problem. The real problem we're dealing with here, Will, is the way our adversaries think about the problem. And until we start thinking the way they do, how we think about the problem is irrelevant. All that matters really is how they think about the problem, how they're going to break in, what they're going to do. Right? Take it. I've watched getting prep for this. I watched several of your videos where you're doing instruction on people on defenders. And people scoring goals. The thing is, if you really want to defend against somebody, you got to think about what they're going to do, not what you're going to do, right? So what does this guy do? How does he do this? How does he do that, right? And so that's the way we kind of got to look at stuff. So that's how I kind of got into, that's how I did get into the issue, especially on cybersecurity. And it's not so much from the bit and byte standpoints. I'm not a programmer. Yeah, I don't sit here and write code, but it's really the thinking behind it, the strategy behind it. What is it we have to protect and why do we have to protect it? And really asking the questions. I learned a great line that kind of set the stage for everything. And it came from Albert Einstein. He said, look, if I had 1 hour to live and my life depended upon asking one question, I would spend the first 55 minutes basically thinking about the right question to ask, and we don't spend enough time doing the critical thinking to ask the right questions of the data. So that's really how I kind of got into this. Started doing a lot of stuff with the State Department, anti-terrorism assistance program, working with countries to help them better defend and protect their stuff. Because guess
Uh-huh.
what? It is a connected world. The internet has no concept of distance. I don't actually have to be in a country to commit a crime in that country anymore. 50 years ago, if you wanted to rob a bank like the old bank robber, I guess it's attributed to him, Willie Sutton. Why do you rob banks? Well, because that's where the money is. I don't got to be there anymore. I can be in Russia. I can be in South America. I can be in New Zealand. So that's kind of what
Yeah.
precipitated all of this.
I mean, incredibly fascinating, especially due to the fact that you are drawing on some similarities. We had a guy named Sean McFate on, who is professor of strategy. I don't know if you know him. He's also working right there, right around where you are at the Pentagon, and he said something similar. He's written a new book called I believe it's The New War or The New Rules for War,
Hmm.
in the sense that there's currently, he says that America just in general has strategic atrophy, in the sense that we go about things in a way that is, certain parts of us we go about ways of war, obviously in the old sense, like we're going to prepare for a World War II
Right.
showdown that's really never going to happen. The World War III isn't going to happen in the way that we think, right? And so that question, that thing that you stated, essentially, that as a defender, you have to understand how the other person is thinking, is also a very prevalent in what I'm now finding. You're the third person to come on. We had a grandmaster in chess come on. He said the exact same thing, about analysis, about having to understand the game. And so, I always like to draw, these commonalities on things into state that it's clearly something that the average person is maybe lacking, or, deep thought into that is lacking. But I'm curious, just of all the things you've done, and I know we're going to get into some of the details, but I want to touch on the behavioral analysis part
Yep.
and ask what, specifically, given that you've probably seen and met and spoken to so many incredibly interesting individuals like there, is there anything that you could give, to the average person on how to go about judging, understanding, whether that's being in an interview or trying to judge character and all those things? I mean, that's like one of this new things, is like we've got these BuzzFeed lists, like,
Yeah.
oh, if he scratches his nose, he's lying, and if he does,
Yeah, I've
I'm
seen
sure it
those.
annoys you, but
Let me poke a hole in it.
yeah.
Here's the problem with a lot of that. It's all about context. For example, think about a game in which you were playing, Will, and somebody's got video of it. And it looks like they could take a small clip out of context and look like you're actually tripping the guy intentionally, right? As opposed to, well, no, let's put it in context and realize you got hit by another guy, which bumped you into this guy. You weren't doing it intentionally. It was an accident. But if I just cut that clip, it looks like you're doing that. And that's the whole problem when you see these lists with BuzzFeed and stuff like that. They don't understand it is so important to set context. I'll give you an example.
Mm.
I used to, some of the interviews I did were people that were going to go to prison for the rest of their lives. When I was investigating homicides, things like that, or when I was teaching out at the National Security Agency, we were teaching damage assessment agents, people who investigated the impact that espionage had on the United States, people who had investigated the Alder James case, Earl Edwin Pitts, the CIA traders. And Pitts was also an FBI agent who turned bad, Harold James Nicholson, all of these guys. And the one thing about it is that unless you understood that, unless you had it in context, your question was irrelevant, because you needed to frame the questions in such a way based on the context that then when I saw you react to something, it was what you did before the question, it was what you did during the question, and it's what you did after the question. I'll give you a quick example. I don't want to give away too many state secrets because I don't want people going out and committing crimes and getting good at
Yeah,
lying.
of course.
But
What you can, yeah.
here's practical advice, though. For example, let's say that you're hiring somebody for your organization, Will, and you want to bring them on, and you want to know, are they being truthful or not? A lot of what you do is you look at their so when people say, well, he scratched his nose, he's lying. Well, it depends. It depends. Scratching your nose can be a sign of deception. It doesn't mean, we don't say lying exactly. It's you're being deceptive. In other
Mm.
words, that's why in court they say the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, because those three things mean something. For example, I might be truthful about some things, but not truthful about the others. And here's a perfect example. I say, Will, have you ever run a stop sign or sped? And you could truthfully answer no, because you might have never run a stop sign in your life, never, but you might speed all the time. But because I asked that question back to back, you can truthfully answer that, as opposed to, Will, have you ever run a stop sign? And then wait for your answer. And then, Will, have you ever sped? And then what I'm looking at is your activities before, during, and after. And the great one is with women. When people will look at women and say, well, she has her arms crossed, she's being deceptive. Well, no, you fool. Is the room cold? That's what I found a lot of times. When the room gets cold, what do? You cross your arms. So you set a
Yeah.
baseline for your interview, and you understand, how are they reacting? What questions are they saying? Then when I ask you, I'm looking for certain things. Here's an easy one. One of the ways guys stall for time to think about an answer, I might say, "Will, have you ever driven over 100 miles an hour?" And you might do something like, "What, have I ever driven over 100 miles an hour?" You repeat the question back, or
Yeah.
guys cough and then they reach down and they pull up their socks. Believe it or not, guys will reach down to pull up their socks because it's a delaying tactic.
Okay.
You're trying to think of the
Yeah.
answer. And one of those things comes across when I'm accusing somebody of a crime. Like I might say, I might be talking to Joe Bob the farmer and I say, "Joe Bob, did you rob this bank? Have you ever robbed a bank?" And they might say, "I did not rob that bank with this gun. I robbed a different bank with that gun, or I robbed this bank, but with a knife or a different gun." But what you're looking for is did he repeat the question? Did he cough? Did he delay? Did he stall? Now, the reason why some people scratch their nose, it's actually a response, capillary response to the constriction of blood. When you're being deceptive and you're manifesting that anxiety inside, you actually start constricting the blood flow. And one of the manifestations of a lack of blood flow on your nose is a tingling sensation. That
Mm.
doesn't mean you're being deceptive. It doesn't mean you're lying. It means you're being deceptive about something. So that's where you have to kind of drill down. So and the other thing people get confused about, they always say, "Well, he interrogated me." No, I interviewed you. There's two different things. There's an interview, which is non-accusatory. Then there's an interrogation, which is accusatory.
Okay.
An interview always an interrogation is always preceded by an interview, but an interview does not always lead to an interrogation. I might interview you and find out based on your answers, your body language, you're fine. And here's an interesting stat too. The company I was doing this training for, when we taught the Secret Service, FBI, CIA, state and local law enforcement, they did a study with the National Security Agency years ago, and they had 300 cases that they knew the outcomes on. Not the people involved in the research, but the NSA did. And what they did is what they would do is you could all you could do was hear. You could only hear what was going on. Then you shut the audio off, and then you could only see what was going on. Then you gave them the audio and the video together. Then you gave them the audio, video, and along with the case facts. And so here's the thing. You know what is the most accurate indicator of deception? It's body language.
Okay.
It's not what people say, it's how they react. And so what we found out was that if you listen to the audio only, you were only accurate about 55 to 58% of the time. If you saw the body language, you were accurate about 78 to like 82%. If you had the body, like, or if you had the audio and video together, you were like at 88%. And then if you had the body language, or you have the audio video along with the case facts, what we found out the final outcome was a properly trained interviewer utilizing both verbal and nonverbal behavior, correctly armed with the case or armed with the case facts, can correctly assess truthful or deceptive behavior 93% of the time. That is more accurate than
Wow.
a polygraph.
And so I want to touch on the context part that you laid out there as well, because as we've said, some of those lists are just giving you just a little quick checklist of like, if they
Yep.
do this, that's a lie. If they do this, and obviously many of the books that I have read on, on body language and stuff like that, clearly they're stating what you're stating. Obviously there's more to the picture and that needs to
Yep.
be done. But I think it's a perfect transition into the idea that obviously, like you said, you need the whole picture, which brings us to the current state of society today, where big data is everything and trying to grab everything and know everything so that you can then make a decision on this. I mean, companies and consultant companies actually reach out to us all the time to let us know we can take everything that you've got there and we'll give you guys, the direction here, there, and the other. I mean, I have a few questions down the whole
Yeah.
data route, but I would like to know, just first off, as we currently state, most people don't have a good grasp. And even after reading Edward Snowden's book, I understand that the government is doing some stuff, and where do we stand as a society? As how secure is the stuff on my computer from someone else? Or that's not good that you're laughing. That's not really good.
Hey,
You know?
let me put it, or let me give you the story and it'll kind of put it in context. Again, let's put it in context. I
Okay.
was moderating a panel for MIT one time, and on it, I had people, including a former NSA lawyer, a couple bigwigs. I simply asked him a question. I said, "Who do you fear more? Who do you fear more? The FBI, the CIA, and the NSA, or Facebook, Amazon, and Google?" They feared Facebook, Amazon, and Google more than the other ones. You know why? Because they collect more data that the government is not allowed to collect. and
Uh-huh.
it requires the government a warrant to collect certain information that I can collect for free. And there's an old Silicon Valley saying that says, "Will, when it's free, then you're the product." Why is Facebook
Uh-huh.
free? Because you're the product. Why is Google free? Because you're the product. The difference between that and Apple, contrast that with their privacy practices. Apple makes you pay for like songs. They don't market, they don't sell data. So
Uh-huh.
that's why you pay for certain things with Apple, or if they give it away to you, it's part of their ecosystem. Like, imagine you met the days where when you bought a computer, you also had to buy Windows to go on that computer. With Apple, they changed that. They
Yeah,
said you
yeah,
buy
I
a
remember.
computer, the software is free. It comes with it, right? Because it's part of our ecosystem. So that's the
Mm.
approach to privacy. So the reason I say that is where these companies are collecting more and more data, psychographic data, demographic data, everything. What they're trying to do. Do you ever find it weird? Is that as you're going along and as you're clicking on things, let's say in Amazon or Facebook, all of a sudden an ad pops up of something you'd been thinking about, but it's like, wow, are they reading my mind? Well, technically, in a
Sure,
way, they
yeah.
are. You know why? Because they can bring together billions of data points of all people that are doing the same thing, and they can look to see when somebody clicks on this, then this, then this. And here's the case study for that. Target is one of the best companies for using data. Target got into a problem one time because they had sent a flyer, one of their ad flyers, but they'd sent a flyer out and it arrived at this house and it said, "Congratulations, on your pregnancy. Here's some products you can buy." And the
Oh,
dad's going,
goodness.
my daughter's 16 years old. She's not pregnant. Well, it turns out she was. Target can
Yeah.
tell if you're buying products for yourself for being pregnant or buying products for somebody else. So that's if you want to know how powerful data can be, that's how powerful data can be. And so now to get to the other question is it secure? So there's two things we got to talk about. There's privacy and security. Privacy is policy. Privacy says here's what we're going to keep secured. Security is how you implement the policy. So it's like the game plan,
Mhm.
right? Game plan on a board doesn't mean anything until you actually go out and do it, right? I'm sure you've written up drills and stuff, but they mean nothing until you actually get out on the field, right? So that's policy and that's security. So it's how you do it. And so overall, even though we're getting better in a lot of ways, last year was the worst year, for example, for ransomware, because these actors are figuring
Yeah.
out. Here's where the behavior part comes into it. So a year ago, from this last January, there was a big campaign that was discovered um, by FireEye, and it was called SolarWinds. It attacked a company called SolarWinds, and it used this malware called Sunburst. And they were able to penetrate several of the government systems and look at emails and pull down data and everything and piece all this stuff together. It was the Russians, Russian intelligence.
Mhm.
But here's what they did, Will. They simply outthought us. And that's why I said, remember, the problem isn't the problem. The problem isn't the way we think about it. It's the way our adversaries think about it. What happened was, and I won't get geeky, but there's software out there for endpoint protection, like your computers, your phones, servers, at the very ends that protects
Yeah.
that stuff. And so in these environments, when they want to launch, think about breaking in a new pair of shoes, right? You just don't go into a game with a new pair of shoes. You try them on for a while. You got to, well, that's the same way with software. You don't just put software into your production environment, to the main environment. You bring it into what they call a sandbox. You look at it, watch it for a few days, and you go, okay, it's not doing anything bad, and then you push it to your production environment. All the Russians did was sit back and go, what is the average length of time these companies, and especially this company called SolarWinds, was looking at their software, and people were looking at their software before they pushed it in the production environment.
Oh, wow.
Now, here's the thing, though. Why did they target SolarWinds? This goes back to the behavioral part of it. SolarWinds was a network management tool that was deployed on many, 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 and I mean many government computers and systems. For that tool to work, you had to give it access to everything. It's like the old
Sure.
antivirus on your laptops. For
Yeah, of
antivirus to
course.
work, you got to give it access to every file. Well, this had access to every system. What they found in a lot of these places, the people were only looking at that new application or that new software for 3 days. When it didn't do anything bad, it pushed it out into the production environment. So all the Russians did was go, comrade, you go 3 days, we wait 10 days, pop up our little
Exactly.
periscope, say, hey, we're in the right
Exactly.
environment. And then they executed. All they did was outthink us. They waited 10 days
Mhm.
instead of three. Had they
Right.
executed within 3 days, a lot of their stuff would have been caught. But because they were pushed out into the environment, they were actually able to turn off some companies' endpoint protection
Wow.
programs. They were actually able to basically infiltrate the software and shut things off, tamper with it. And
Mhm.
that's what they did. They simply outthought us. So to your point of how secure is things, security is relative. Security is all based upon how much time and effort are you willing to expend to protect it. For example, Could you defend? Again, I go back to soccer because you know soccer better than me. But I'm not a smart guy,
Sure.
but I kind of think that I could defend. I could make sure pretty much that a team never scored a goal against us if I surrounded my goalie with all the players and created an impenetrable wall. Right?
Yeah,
How
sure.
tough? How easy would it be to score? Right? The only problem is while everybody's down at that side of the field, you don't have anybody on offense. You know, making goals. So the game may always end up 0-0.
Hmm.
The
Hmm.
match, right? So, but what are you willing to do to defend it? And so everything is a trade off between price and security. Airports are a great example, right? After 9/11, we started screening everything. I mean, I was in Orlando coming back. The stuff I did for the guys in the intelligence community, I had friends there. I got the call. I got out to the airport early the day that they discovered the people in London that were uh, mixing stuff together to create liquid bombs. They were going to blow up airplanes. So that whole plot came apart. Actually, two of my
Yeah,
friends
yeah.
were in the counterterrorism command in New Scotland Yard, were involved in that case. And so it's just the way they. So what did the hijackers do? They simply outthought security. So we, to your point earlier, we're
Mm.
fighting. We're always fighting yesterday's war. We think the solution to what happened on 9/11 and on 9/12 is we create cockpits. That's not the problem. They had Richard Reed, the shoe bomber. You had the other people creating bombs. You got people doing so. Our adversaries are always outthinking us. I actually was working inside the Department of Justice on a big information sharing program. We were helping prepare briefing materials for the Attorney General that they were using in the 9/11 Commission hearings. The biggest lesson out of the 9/11 Commission was a failure of imagination. That's what led
Uh-huh.
to this. We could not imagine somebody hijacking a plane and flying it into a tower. Well, that's again, doesn't matter how we think. What matters? How did our adversaries think? What were the terrorists thinking? So you can take those lessons and apply them. What does that have to do with cyberspace? Everything. Because the Russians still think the same way they always have for over 100 years. The initial intelligence organization they created was called the V-Cheka out of World War One. They have been masters at this. Why are there more Russian grandmasters in chess than any other? Because of the way they strategically think, right?
Mhm.
What happens is their tactics don't change, just the tools, right? 50 years ago, if you wanted to create a smear campaign or do an information influence operation, you wrote a letter and had it planted in an obscure little paper in Italy, which then got sent to Spain, which then got to Europe and then to the United States. Now it's social
Yeah.
media. The Russians are doing the same thing with social media that they did 50 years ago with sending letters to the editor and starting the whole campaign. So
Mhm.
the reason I say all of that, what does it come? We bring it back full circle. Everything about security is all relative. It's all relative to how much risk are you willing to spend money on to prevent from happening, um, as
Right.
opposed to how much flexibility do you need in your ability to operate. And so we constantly are making trade offs. So I could prevent every injury to every soccer player ever. I could outfit you guys in
Yeah.
gear, and nobody would ever get hurt again. The only problem was you'd be about as fast as
Yeah, you can't move. Full cast.
couldn't
Bubble
move.
bubble guy.
Yeah, bubble
Yeah,
boy, and all they'd have to do is knock you over, and you'd be laying on the ground like a turtle, going, "Somebody help me
exactly.
up!" Right? That's not. But you make trade offs, right? You make trade offs
Right.
between. And if you look at the game of American football, because I know you've got an international audience, but the
For
way
sure.
look back to the days of when the shoulder pads were huge. The technology has gotten better. Well, with that technology that's gotten better, people can move faster because there's less weight. They can do things. You've got bigger linemen now, and you've got technology now that prevents those bad knee injuries. You'll see linemen wearing those braces, but it's a trade-off,
Mhm.
right? You don't see running backs and wide receivers wearing those heavy braces. Why? Because they need the ability to move and be flexible. Same thing on a soccer field. So everything
Right.
we do in cybersecurity is really based on life. How much are you willing to spend on a car to get all the features you want versus how much safety do you want? You can make a car completely safe, but here's the deal: you would never be able to afford it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it'd be full of steel and
Armor plating,
but
and yeah, they
yeah.
would only go 10 miles an hour to make sure that there were no bad crashes. And
Yeah, yeah. It brings up an interesting thing because of all and now I mean I get that. I do understand that. And it's interesting because as for practical, we're in such an interesting subject here because practical. The thing is that for most let's just leave it in America and even though I know it's everyone across the world when we look at security like on our phones it's just kind of like you just do the thing that you need to do. Most people in America, a lot of people, let's just say, are have a lot of Apple products. iPhone is incredibly popular. You just kind of think that it's okay. There was obviously, I would say, a form of a myth that that you could never really hack or get into, or your iPhone or your Apple computer and stuff is completely safe. Like no one could get into that in any in any fashion or in any way. and that's obviously not true. But based on what you're saying and the idea that you can draw these connections, I just want to take it to a not necessarily a conspiratorial place. But have you seen the movie Minority Report?
Oh, absolutely, man. Pre-crime bureau with Tom Cruise and
Is that possible? Yeah, yeah. Is that possible, or is that going to be possible, or is that happening?
so it's interesting you say that. There's a lot of research. I actually had the chance to ride back with somebody who was in the CIA for many, 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 many years. He was chief of station in Vienna, worked on some big cases, and we're driving back. And of course, he can't say too much, but I say, look, what is the most unique thing the CIA was working on that you think, that would be like, cool, I know you can't say it. And he simply thought about it for a second. He goes, brainwaves. And now when you think about, when you look at what Elon Musk is doing with his chip that's implanted, when you start
Neuralink,
looking at
yes.
how we can now start looking at the way people act based on large amounts of data, right? Now, do I think that we'll be able to look into the future? That's not in our lifetime. I just read an article too to where scientists have just done the smallest scale form, basically warp transformation ever. I mean, it was on an extremely small scale. But Einstein's theory of relativity, and exceeding the speed of light, mass becomes infinite the closer you get to the speed of. I don't know if we'll ever get there. So this whole thing about going back in time, I don't know. It could happen
Sure.
3 centuries from now. But here's the
Sure.
problem. Even with that technology, guess what it bumps up against? It bumps up against policy. And so when you look at the Constitution of the United States, when you look at what the UK has, you look at what other countries have, especially in democratic, freedom-loving countries, I find it difficult that you would be able to charge anybody or hold them based on what a computer says they might do, in 6 months, right? So,
Possibly.
but however, though, there is a way to start looking at. I can't always tell. Here's the example. For everybody who has life insurance, your rates are set by somebody called an actuary, somebody who looks at all the data and they say, based on your risk, this is yours. You're a healthy guy, you're a young guy, Will, so your rates are going to be lower than somebody who's severely obese and got heart conditions, because they looked at the risk, right? Actuaries can tell you how many people are going to die each year, what cause, what race, what occupation. They just can't tell you who. So
Mm-hmm.
that's what Minority Report is. They're trying to say, here's who's going to do it. But now there are ways, if you can collect enough data and connect the dots together, you can start saying, I know crime is going to occur in this area, and then put police in there. It's called intelligence-led policing. They do it a lot of times. Our intelligence community gathers chatter. Why do we know certain terrorist attacks are going to happen? Because we see an increase in chatter electronically or movements of stuff. Look at what's going on. You're in Zagreb, right now?
Yeah, yeah. I'm in Zagreb.
Yeah, not too far from you.
Not too far.
Yeah,
No, yeah.
not too far from you is a country called Ukraine. I say not too far, right? And what's going on
Yeah.
with Russia, right? Same thing right there. What's actually happening, right? Are Russian forces really pulling back? Is that what we believe? There's so much data. We see a lot of data out there right now. Again, it's not what we think; it's what Vladimir Putin thinks. And so when we start
Mhm.
looking at, can we predict what's going to happen? Well, we know based upon the amount of forces Russia has, where they've positioned them, the types of assets they have, what their skill sets are, they're poised for an invasion. This is not a training exercise. They're poised for an invasion. So we can look at large data. I can't tell you when they're going to do it. I can just tell you
Mhm.
based on what they have, this is the most likely outcome. So in areas like Chicago, Detroit, areas where there's a concentration of crime, you can start looking at events that are happening, like large sporting events. What's the number one crime they look for? Believe it, I'd say number one, but one of the top crimes they look for around the Super Bowl is human sex trafficking. People are bringing in
Really?
women, yeah,
Uh-huh.
to work the game, because you got an influx of hundreds now,
Of
thousands
course.
of people now. Kind of post
The
COVID, we're getting
money.
back to an area. You've got all
Yeah,
these
yeah, yeah.
people coming in. So you start looking at what are the
Yeah.
indicators of human sex trafficking. Now, does that mean that girl is being trafficked? I don't know, but she has the indicators that indicate she's traveling alone or with somebody she doesn't know. She appears to be underage, doesn't have a good reason.
Mhm.
Now, it could be is that she's, just be candid. It could be that she's mentally ill and her dad's taken her, someplace to get treatment, and
Sure.
she just doesn't know. Or on the other hand, it
Right.
could be is that she just doesn't know because she's been trafficked, right? So just because you have the indicators doesn't mean it, but you have to do a little bit more stuff. But that's why I say, is Minority Report real? I would say, like with any movie, suspension of belief, it's a good story. But now, are some parts of that real? Absolutely. The whole goal, and this actually comes from something Sir Robert Peel said in 1829. He's the father of the London Metropolitan Police Department and the father of community policing. Basically, he says, uh, the absence of basically, you can tell how safe a community is by the absence of police on the streets, not by the presence of it.
Mm.
So the safer a community is, the more you do your job, the fewer you see police, right? But if you put a cop on every street corner, the assumption is this is not a safe area. You can put a cop on every street corner, that does not stop crime. So,
Right.
there's so many ways we can go with this. I love questions like this because it ties
Yeah.
in so many things.
Yeah, and I'm going to keep going down that route, just at least for this next question, with a question on cyber attack and this idea that more or less you see these scenarios that they kind of put up. And I don't know, I can't name a movie specifically, but I know that this has either been in plenty of shows, like maybe like, I don't know, 24 or one of these shows, where the idea for a cyber attack and the way that they're going to start the next war would be like, they're going to come in. If someone was to attack America, obviously, strategically, the position is just it's a bit of an issue, right? To attack America, that they would go through, say, a cyber attack would be necessary first. That they'd shut down whatever electricity, ability to ship things here and there, and stuff like that. uh, I'm assuming that the government prepares for some, or has some sort of simulation, has run some simulations on this sort of thing. But the question I have is that even at all remotely possible? Is that something that the average person should ever think, if we have a conflict, a true one with China, that they are just going to shut down the West Coast, and then they'll be able to send in all their. It seems so far fetched, but I don't understand why this is the true next step. Is this anything that's remotely possible at all,
Yeah.
or could we do it to someone?
Oh, absolutely. So first of all, can we do it? You bet we can. We're still good at that. Give you a sports example. It's like asking a coach, how's your team? Well, we get an A on offense, but we suck on defense. We're a D, or a
Uh-huh.
C. So you want a team that's balanced, and we need a balance. I'll tell you this: nobody imagined on December 6th, 1941, that the Japanese would bomb Pearl Harbor. Right? Nobody imagined we could put a man on the moon. Nobody imagined that the Russians were going to beat us to space. There are so many failures of
Sure.
imagination that
Yeah.
what I tell people is, I said, you need to prepare. Whether it's a cyber attack, whether it's an actual just a act of nature. Look, somebody cutting out the power through a cyber attack, or a storm comes through and it wipes out power. The effect on the populace is still the same. You still got to be prepared for it. I'll give you a good example of this, and this goes back to something that happened last April. You were out of the country, but I'm sure you read about. They had this huge ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline. Colonial supplies power and fuel to most of
Mm.
the eastern seaboard. So planes, automobiles, all of these folks relied upon that. What the hackers did, what the attackers did, they got ransomware on it. They didn't affect the production systems, the things that actually produce the oil. They just affected the systems that allow them to manage the movement of it and bill for it. They affected the administrative systems. But yet people responded as though they were out of fuel. They responded as though there was no more. We've got the enduring image from this. People, so if this is the first time people actually saw what a ransomware or a cyber attack could do, people were hoarding fuel. They were heading to the store again. And the enduring image of this one older lady pouring gasoline into a plastic bag in the trunk of her car, one of these shopping bags, filling it up with gas. And this goes back to war, right? In traditional war, the purpose of war is to break things and kill people. It's a bad occupation to be in. You don't want to have to do it, but if you're at war, that's what you do. In cyber, you go after two things, actually three things. You go after power, water, and food. If I want to create mass confusion and create chaos in a society, I go after power. What happens when people are without power? I mean, you know from growing up in the Missouri, Kansas area, when we would get bad snowstorms, you'd have ice storm
No,
stuff come
yeah.
in, right? If you're without power for 24 hours, people go, okay, I can handle that. But then it's like, oh, it's 48 hours and we don't have power. It's 72 hours and we don't have power.
Yeah.
The anxiety starts going up. What happens to our food supplies? Do we have enough water, et cetera, right? So imagine doing that to a country, which, by the way, I was in Florida last weekend when we were recording this. I actually gave a briefing to a conference I was the keynote speaker at, and it's actually called Cyber Strike Warfare in the Fifth Domain. And what I did is I war gamed this out a few years ago, presented at the National Defense University to DHS, FBI, some guys. And I said, here's my theory about how Russia will invade Ukraine. And it's exactly what you're talking about. It's no longer it's no longer like Hitler invaded Poland as the
Yeah.
pretext for World War II. You bring in tanks and stuff. Now it's the war is already going on. The war in cyberspace is already going on. They're attacking power. They're attacking banking systems. They're attacking means of communication. By the way, when you talk, one of the biggest vulnerabilities I think every nation has is their power grid. It's the power supply. So the first big use of malware that was called black energy was used by Russia against Ukraine, December 23rd, 2015. Why do I know that date? Well, for one thing, it's one of my son's birthdays, not 2015, but that date. But here's Russia's unique. This is why you have to understand your adversary. Why did they pick December 23rd, 2015? What is the big issue with Russia right now? What is their big fear that who will Ukraine become a member of that Russia does not want them to? And it's NATO.
Yeah, NATO. Right.
You know what happened on December 23rd, 2014 by a vote of 330, I think, to 83? The Ukrainian parliament changed their status from non-aligned to an aligned nation so they could join which organization?
NATO. Really?
What do we have for him, Johnny? Yeah. And
Wow.
so what Russia has done, Russia has used Ukraine as their digital proving grounds for their cyber attacks, their cyber weapons. So what we see going on in Ukraine will be the same types of things. Now, I will tell you, it does get to be a bridge too far. If it is a direct nation state attack against the United States, that now, based on our new rules of engagement and our new authorities, that is an act of war. But that's why they always use proxies. That's why China uses proxies. We use proxies. I mean, our intelligence community, we use proxies.
Yeah.
That's why the Houthi rebels are proxies for Iran. They get rockets and stuff from Iran, and the Houthi rebels can fire stuff at the UAE. If Iran directly attacked UAE, the whole Mideast would be in chaos, right? So, but you're absolutely right, man. If I want, think about this. Even where you're at right now, if I cut off your communications, if I cut off your access to money, if I cut off your power, and if I affected your water supply, how long would people be able to hold it together before they would start losing it?
Oh, not very long at all. I can't name a place where it would be okay. Maybe in a place where they weren't already reliant on all of those things.
Yeah, one of those Nat Geo things, like above the Arctic Circle. They're used to that already.
If they're already doing with it, then that's the only way I can see it. But before I want to switch these entirely, you mentioned in another podcast that you learned Farsi, and it sounded like you had learned more than one language. That's a huge thing. We have a 𝗪𝗟𝗡 Languages. We have a channel there. I speak 9 languages myself, and we run around.
Well, I saw your episode with the Irish polyglot.
Oh, you saw that one? Okay, so that's Benny. Yeah. Well, we speak only in English there. I mean, Benny speaks a ton of languages. But yeah, so I'm curious. What did you have to learn? Has that been a part of your journey, or just a little bit? Or
on the job, I had to learn a lot of Spanish. So at one time, I was pretty good, fluent Spanish speaker because of the area I was assigned, and plus working in Colombia and stuff, you had to learn that. Growing up, I learned Farsi as a kid. I would pick up stuff in German and Russian, just a little bit of stuff, here and there. I never, for me, occupationally, I didn't need to learn those languages. So I never, and it's one thing is, I wish I would have learned more, because to me, it's because here's why. To understand how somebody thinks, there is a great movie that Clint Eastwood went in, and it was called Firefox. I don't know if you saw that one, but it's about him, where he was. They inserted him to be a Russian pilot to steal one of the new Russian stealth jet fighters. Here's the thing, though. You just couldn't. The commands, it was so futuristic. You're talking about reading minds. So the helmet was wired in to respond to commands that you were thinking, but it had to be in Russian. He was translating, but he had to think natively, right? So he had to think as the pilot. He had to think as the Russian. So when you start understanding Russian sayings, things that they do, for example, I'm writing a book right now where Russia plays a key role in it, with a guy who a detective who used to be in the CIA, but nobody knows that, so he has special skills. Well, Russia, like we say, let's hurry up and stuff. Russians have a saying called "Don't rush the horses," and they have other stuff too. And so, if you understand the way people think about stuff and what drives them, it's not what we think, it's what they think. So that's the reason I wish I would have learned more languages, because it really helps you then understand when they respond to something and when they think about something. Do they care, or are they teaching you a lesson through the response, or is it more of an F off, mate, I don't want to talk to you? The context is so important. That's why learning the language is, I think, key.
It does. It gives you a chance to push into a culture. And I mean, I've talked about this a whole lot, and I do so on 𝗪𝗟𝗡 Languages, is that I've only spent 3 or 4 days in Italy. My Italian knowledge is vast. It's vast. And I love the language, and I speak it quite well. And I feel like I'm within that, having only spent 3, 4. I mean, the time that I was there, actually, every person kept asking me how long I'd lived in Italy. And so it was just fun as the days were going on, be like, this is my first day. Now this is my second day here. This is my third day in the country, And so you're 100% right. But I don't want to miss out on this chance to ask you about Russia and Ukraine, because you did touch on it, though.
Yep.
Just the one thing on it. If this happens, and if you are saying, I mean, I know you're not officially stating, yes, I believe that it's going to happen, but let's imagine that all the indicators are there and it does happen sometime in the near future. What does our world look like? What's the reaction going to look like from the West? Are they going to just let it happen? I mean, I played in Georgia. I played in Georgia, the country, obviously.
Georgia, which was
And
invaded by Russia in 2008.
it was invaded, and nobody really, it's
What
not
did they
like
do when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014?
which another place I'd been to when it was Ukraine, and nothing really happened. So I'm curious, like, all the rhetoric right now is about obviously World War III, and I know that's what's going to sell the papers and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But what do you really feel is a legitimate situation for if a conflict actually happens?
So I have an ongoing discussion with a buddy of mine who's a major in the U.S. military, and
Mm.
we talk about we talk about these things back and forth, and we both kind of agree. Two things. So first of all, there's this thing called IPB, intelligence preparation of the battlefield. You have to understand. Again, we get back into context. You got to put everything into context. What is the ground like? What's the weather like? So here's two factors that will determine whether Russia invades or not. Number one, it's the weather. Why? Because Russia has a lot of tanks. The only way tanks work really well is on solid ground. You try and run them through mush and mud,
Mm.
they don't work so well. And the minute that they get bogged down, the Javelin anti-tank missiles, which are lethal to begin with, become even more lethal when you've got a static target like a Russian tank. The second thing is it's just you cannot maintain what they call a high operational tempo. You can't have a very high op tempo. You can't have all your forces ready to go. Think about this for a game. You can only get people pumped up for the game so much before you got to get them out on the field and start letting them play in the game. But if you try pumping them up for 2 hours straight before the game, they're worn out by the time you
Yeah,
get there. It's like, dude,
yeah,
yeah, I've run out of
too much.
energy.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
you run out of momentum, you run out of energy. So if something's going to happen, it's really based. They peak frost was about the first week of February in Ukraine. So you've got to, if they're going to do something. The other reason they're waiting is because of the Winter Olympics. Xi Jinping, the Olympics are officially over. I think on this
Yes.
Friday, which is February 18th. I think they're coming
Mhm.
to an end. I don't think because of this burgeoning relationship between Vladimir and Xi Jinping, he's not going to do anything to take away from the Olympics. Now, all bets are off. But to your point, you say all of that to say this. I can't tell you if Vlad will do it or not, but what he's doing,
Mm.
there have been cyber attacks against the Ministry of Defense, against several of the banks, against communication systems, right? So cyber attacks now are your prelude a lot of times to war. The war is already underway. It's just in cyberspace, which is the fifth domain of war: sea, air, land, space. Now it's cyberspace. So
Mm.
if it happens, kind of what we think is, first of all, Russia or Ukraine is not a NATO member, so you cannot invoke Article 5 of NATO, which says an attack on one NATO member is an attack on everybody. Russia does not want
Gotcha.
NATO involved. Why? Because they get their ass kicked on the battlefield. You bring all the NATO, even China. Everybody worries about China, but I tell you right now, talking about right now, our Pacific Fleet would wipe
Uh-huh.
the map with them. Now, 10 years from
Right.
now, could be something different, but right now, we can project force in a way China can't. But in Ukraine, I think what happens if Vlad see this is why the shelling that started over there in eastern Ukraine by Russian separatist forces and stuff. Russia, the Duma, already came out with a proposal to ask Vladimir to recognize two regions, the Donbass, and I can't think of the other region right now. I think it begins with an L, but two regions. Recognize them as part of Russia. He's handing out a bunch of passports. He's already ceding the ground. He's creating chaos. So if Russia goes in, I think we will feed them a lot of material. We'll feed them defense stuff, but the United
Uh-huh.
States or NATO will not get directly involved because they don't want to create a regional conflict. But I think what happens if Russia goes in, we're simply going to look at containing it. I mean, you will not get anybody responding to it. We'll do as much as we can to help the Ukrainian defense forces. It'll be bloody.
Mhm.
It'll be bloody between Russia and
Wow.
Ukraine. And I think what happens then is we have to look at how do we contain it? And what I'm driving at is I think what happens if they get in, they'll be condemned. There'll be lots of stuff, but we've sanctioned the heck out of Russia. I mean, what else can we do to them? I mean, there's a couple
Right.
things we can do that are the nuclear option, but you don't want to you don't want to take punitive action until they do something. But when we don't want them to do something, but the threat is you can remove them from the world banking system, from the SWIFT system. You can hurt them economically. And the other thing you can do is Germany is kind of the linchpin for right now because of the Nord Stream pipeline. You've got to get Germany on board. You've got to have them firm
Mhm.
up. Is like Maggie Thatcher said to George H.W. Bush, during the initial Gulf War and stuff, George, don't go wobbly on me now. So we can't have
Uh-huh.
Germany afford to wobble because Germany is a NATO partner, believe it or not. But hey, who would have thought a country that we defeated in World War II would now become an
Of
ally, right?
course. Yeah.
Japan.
Yeah. No.
We dropped 2 bombs on Japan, and Japan is a very strong ally. So all of these things we thought couldn't happen, it's not relevant anymore. But to your point, I think if Russia goes in, they go in, or it may be on the edges there. Kiev is the capital, that area there, but they've already
Yeah.
done
I've
this
been there.
before. By the way, here's a quick bit of history to tie this all together.
Sure.
When I was talking about Russia and their sense of history, so in 2015, that attack I told you on Ukraine's power grid, it attacked the Zaporizhzhia hydroelectric plant on the Dnieper River. They took out 3 power stations, 2 backup stations, etc. Why did they attack that? Because in 1941, Hitler, Operation Barbarossa, his plan to invade Russia, they were coming up through Ukraine. That same river, Dnieper River, what did Stalin do? He blew up the same dam that was attacked in 2015. He blew it up in 1941, killed 100,000 Ukrainians. He was trying to stop the advance of the German army because they were kicking his
Wow.
butt at that time. Stalin,
Wow.
Russia has already attacked Ukraine. They've attacked the same dam. This is something replete history and over again. And the final reason I think if Vlad invades, what Vlad's picture of the world is, he wants to
Mm.
constitute the satellite of countries that used to be the USSR, which then had Georgia and
Of course. Azerbaijan and
Azerbaijan, all the
Latvia and all
stands,
that. Yeah.
and everything.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
wants the glory of the Soviet Union again. That's what I think his ultimate goal is.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, right, he more or less kind of bubbled into power at the end of the,
Cold War. Yeah.
at the end of the Cold War, right, and everything was breaking down in their sense, and yeah, I find it fascinating. I really don't know, and it's a place that I've been. I have friends over there. I have friends in both countries, obviously, as well, and no, we're not too far away from it, but it's just interesting to see what might happen with the fallout.
Well,
You,
here's one quick point
go ahead.
though. All of these people who say they
Yeah.
know what Vladimir Putin's going to do, they're liars. Nobody knows what Vlad's going to do. Now, you know why? Because
Is he
uh,
not habitual in his actions
he's
over the course of this?
predictable.
He's
Look,
been a ruler.
here's
Okay.
the one thing. Here's the one thing, and I learned this from some people who have known Russia far better than I have and dealt with him. Vladimir, he's going to do what he says he's going to do. If he's going to do something, he will figure out a way to do it. So if he says
Yeah.
he's going to, now this is a whole deception. Them moving troops around, all they did, this is the shell game. They moved troops from here to troops to there. They didn't withdraw forces at the end of their quote training exercise. They actually repositioned them, and there's 7,000 more troops along the northeastern border, which is something they do every 4 years. It's called ZAPAD. It's a quadrennial exercise with Belarus. Why? Because Belarus is on the north and northwestern corner of Ukraine. And so this is all part of a strategy of Vlad's. See, and here's the other problem too, Will. Too many times, and this is a fault of America, and we got to change our thinking. You were talking earlier about changing we have a deficit in the way we think strategically. We think about election cycles. Well, I got to get this done because I'm up for election in 2 years or 4 years or 6 years, whatever. China, Russia, they don't think that way. North
You
Korea
don't
doesn't
have
think that
to.
way.
Yeah.
Iran doesn't think that
No.
way. So we've got to get past this whole thinking. And that's the problem with publicly traded companies. I used to work at some, and I used to joke. I said, "We're not a publicly traded company. We're just a collection of 490-day business plans. Our old business plan every 90 days is to
Yeah.
get to the next quarterly earning call so we can look good. We don't have a strategy. We have a collection of
Right.
90-day business plans. But when you're a privately held company and you're not driven by the market, you can take different, for example, like you can make different
Exactly.
bets and do different things and let it play out over time. Not in a publicly traded company. It's all about results. What are we doing for this
Mhm.
quarter? What have you done for me lately?
Yeah.
That's the fallacy in our thinking. We don't think enough long term, and we don't have the commitment long term. Because as parties change, there's an old saying: elections have consequences. Depending on who is your person, it might be good for you, it might be bad for you, but elections have consequences. So our policy against a certain country could change based on the election cycle.
Yeah. And I mean, it's really strange to look at countries like that have such a long, and I mean, and China is I guess you could say notorious or famous or infamous for
One of those
this
words,
having such
yeah.
a long, yeah, such a long distance macro scale look at what could be and what was possible. And so there's they always lurk, and Russia too, obviously. And I mean, I guess they're not really the only ones because many countries have a certain ability. I mean, at the same sense, obviously, America does have some sort of values that allow it to go. And I mean, we obviously have our intelligence agencies that play a very big role in how
Yep.
things continue to go. And a lot of those people who are in military positions are there for quite some time, and they come through. Presidents change and go, policies change and go, parties have power, hold power, and these guys are more or less there. So, I do find it interesting, but I know we have our own ways of holding together some sort of
Oh no,
strategy.
look, we're very good. The U.S. Cyber Command now is split off from the National Security Agency, so you've got them. I think it's the 80th Military Intelligence Brigade. They're very good at cyber warfare. Trust me, we are good. I mean, there's a lot of parity now because, quite frankly, if it was a matchup one-on-one, think about it like boxing. Back in the day, when Mike Tyson was badass and undefeated and just
Yeah.
everybody feared, imagine him taking on a junior Olympics champion. It'd be a total wipeout, right? There was no parity. But what happens if that junior Olympic champion could hire a Buster Douglas? Obviously
Mhm.
Mike Tyson's first loss, right? This is what
Yeah.
this is what cyberspace has done. It's created parity between other people who in the kinetic world, the physical world, would be no match for the United States. But there is a lot more parity in cyberspace than what we would like. But we still have a lot of great tools. We still have a lot of great capacity. But to your point, you mentioned too about the values. I get that there's people out there that don't like the US. Hey, I'm not one of
Sure.
those. I
Yeah.
love the United States. I've been to many countries.
Yeah.
I've lived in Iran. I've been all over the Middle East. I've been in South America.
Sure.
I love where I live, and I know people love where they live, and that's great. I don't talk bad about other countries because it's really never the people. It's the governments, it's the people inside the
Of
governments,
course.
it's the Chinese
For sure.
Communist Party. It's not the Chinese people themselves; it's the Chinese Communist
No.
Party, and it's not the Russians; it's the Russian government. It's Vladimir, right? So. But the reason I say that is we are the good guys. The United States fights with one hand tied behind their back because we don't have unrestricted warfare. And that, by the way, if you really, by the way, thank you for doing all the research you've done and the things that you do, because sometimes you get on podcasts and people are like, hey, well, what do you think about this? Well, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Anyway, here,
Yeah.
if you
Yeah.
want to read a great book, it's
Tell me.
called
Yeah.
Unrestricted Warfare, and it's written by two Chinese
Okay.
People Liberation Army officers. They predict
Okay.
exactly how China will this. For example, it is no coincidence that China is the biggest producer of fentanyl. What how many how many overdose deaths from fentanyl the United States had last year?
It's ridiculous, right?
100,000.
Yeah.
100,000 people were killed from fentanyl. Now, China said, "Oh, we're going to restrict the sale of it." No, all they did is now all the chemicals go to Mexico.
Mhm.
Mexico now is laundering their money back through Chinese banks, and now Mexico is the entry point for fentanyl pills. A friend of mine is the special agent in
U.S.
charge of the
Wow.
DEA office in Phoenix. They are interdicting so many pills per month. The number of pills they interdict per month could kill half the United States.
God. Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
but when you look at the strategy of what they say, of what they can do, and how they view cyber warfare, how they view things like this, there is a direct linkage between the way they're thinking about that and the why is China the big producer of fentanyl and the precursors and sending it to Mexico, because that is part of their overall, and to your point, national strategy. They have a philosophy called 1,000 grains of sand.
Right.
We think long term. We collect all sorts of data, and when I put enough data up there, that those 1,000 grains of sand start becoming a mosaic, and I can start seeing a much bigger picture because everybody's collecting information, everybody's sending it back. We've got all the different units, Unit 61398 of the People's Liberation Army, their first primary cyber aggressor squadron that they had that were out there committing all of these intrusions. So you can go back and look at the whole theory. They write about it. Hitler wrote Mein Kampf. He said exactly what he was going to do.
Right.
Unrestricted warfare. They say what they're exactly going to do. Al Qaeda, and what they said, they wrote exactly what they were going to do. All of these folks, they put out these manifestos. When you look at some of these mass killers that have manifestos out there, they say exactly what they're going to do. There's a reason people write these things down and then act upon them. I wish it was for good, but for these guys do it for bad. But when you read these things, these countries are doing exactly what they say they're going to do, and we just don't believe it. Oh, can't believe
Right.
they did that to us again. How many
Yeah.
times does
And
Lucy have to pull the football away from Charlie Brown before Charlie Brown goes, "Not again, Lucy"?
exactly. Right. Yeah. And Jordan Peterson actually spoke about something really interesting on that, because you mentioned these guys who are
I'm reading his
obviously
book
planning to
right
do.
now. That's my business book, The 12 Principles of
Okay.
Life. Yeah.
Okay, I've read it. It's great. It's great. It's something that gets you very aligned. It helps you ask the right questions. Let's just put it that way. But he mentioned that the guys who did the Columbine massacre, which is a tragic school shooting, for those of you that don't know, many years ago, actually, when I was actually
It was the
probably
very
in
first
high school.
very first mass school shooting.
Yeah. Okay. They had a manifesto of some kind,
Mhm.
and Jordan said, the prevailing idea and opinion was that, okay, these guys are crazy, and he said, okay, well, maybe, but why don't you just look at what they wrote and how they saw the world and what they believed to be perfectly clear logic into why they acted the way they did. And so it just falls back to me on that same, as we can consider them adversaries, right, in the sense of not
Bingo.
understanding
It's
you're
the problem isn't
yeah,
the
you
way
don't
we think about
yeah.
it. It's the way Dylan
Exactly.
Klebold, thought about it.
Yes.
It's the way
Yes.
they thought
Yes.
about it, not the way we think about
Yeah,
it.
yeah. And we were just about here finished, but I want to finish up on just at least one question. But I actually would like to last two, if you've got 2 seconds for
I
these
got
last two
plenty of
questions.
time for another.
Okay.
Well, you were Overland Park for a while, then you were Kansas City, Missouri.
Yeah,
By the
yeah.
way, was it
Yeah.
Missouri Gatorade Player of the Year in high school?
I was. I went because I was in Rockhurst. I was
Yeah.
Missouri. Yeah, Gatorade player. Yeah, it's been a while, but McDonald's All American. As well. I haven't seen that stuff in forever. All these
I ate at McDonald's
American
once.
awards.
That's as close as I got to getting any kind of recognition from Mickey D's. So,
Yeah,
but no, I mean,
yeah. No, it was fun.
but I
It
got
was
plenty
fun.
of
We had
time
a
for you.
game and
What do you need?
okay. So then two things. This second to last one is on China. So I listened to another podcast with a bunch of Australian guys that talk about the universe, ideas, and things that are happening, not just in tech, but how we relate to the world. And they're obviously a bit closer to China, and they have a relationship with China, and China is always kind of doing things over there. One of the things that we see, and obviously China being the power that it is, and obviously, like we said, they have such a long-term view on things. One of the things that they considered to be the reason that they would not succeed in the long run was because the Chinese government basically steals everything. They're not at the forefront of innovation. And there are plenty of countries that are very innovative and creating in America, and obviously because of the world we live in now with the tech boom and all that stuff, we are creating a massive new world. And so their theory was essentially that great, China has this long-term view, but that in the long run it wouldn't work because things are moving so fast now and so quickly that if you just get it and copy it, if there's some new thing, and that's what they do, they tend to do that a lot, the government, that won't work in the long run. And I don't know if that is the prevailing thought. I don't know what you think about that, or is that an impediment for them or not?
Oh, it's an impediment. Have you ever heard of the 3 Rs? Here's
No.
what China does. The U.S. Trade Representative puts out a report, I think, biannually. China is the number one thief of intellectual property in the world. They've stolen 700 billion from the United States alone. China has a approach they call the 3 Rs. First, they rob you of their technology. Then they replicate it. Then they replace you in the market. This is what happens to firms who operate under this fiction that, hey, we can have we can operate in China. We'll go over there. Well, there's one of the issues we've always had is this forced technology transfer that says, well, if you want to work here in China and sell in China, you got to transfer your technology to a Chinese company and partner with them. Well, that Chinese company robs you of everything. They replicate it. Then they replace you in the market. And this has happened to many, many other ones. Here's what I think is not sustainable for China. I think it's part of that. I think it's population, and I think it's control. I think you're starting to see fractures, and the Winter Olympics are starting to show some of the fractures. Let me tell you, China right now is using a lot of bots. They're using a lot of fake social media accounts to project this image of everything's hunky dory in Beijing. It's not. When you look at when the athletes come back, I want to wait till once they get out of China, they clear Chinese airspace and they're back in international
Right.
airspace. I'm waiting for the stories to come out about these forced lockdowns of athletes in the villages. Think about this, Will. Think about you have trained for 4 years to get to the Olympics. Your body is finely tuned. You've got a certain diet you have to eat. You have a certain training regimen. Now they lock you up in a hotel and feed you crap. You don't have any exercise machines,
Yeah.
and they're wondering
Yeah.
why
I'm
the
not gonna
USA is slid to 7th in the medal counts.
Mhm.
I mean, this
Yeah.
is just
It's-
anyway. Let
Yeah.
me stop there. So, but this is why I go sideways. Um,
No,
this is why I think when the stories come out, we'll see what China's liability is, and what I think it is. You can only hold on for power like this for so long. You can only cover up things like Tiananmen Square for so long before people start going. People want freedom. There's a great line out of Jurassic Park. Jeff Goldblum says it. He says, "Nature will find a way." Because the whole theory about Jurassic Park was, well, we've removed this one chromosome from their DNA so they can't replicate. He says, no, nature will find a way. Freedom will find a way in these countries. They have too many people, but that's why they're such a surveillance society. That's why they're so intent on all of this social credit system. That's why Jack Ma with Alibaba. When's the last
Alibaba.
time anybody's
Yeah.
heard from Jack Ma?
I know. He disappeared. That was insane. That's an insane story that probably didn't get enough coverage.
And
A massive
and
CEO.
Ying Ying. Oh, what was the one? There was another Chinese big movie star,
I'm not
social
sure.
media star. A lot of them have disappeared from sight. China can make people
Yeah.
disappear. That can only go on for so long, I think, before. But inside of China, people, there was this one image of this woman who was chained around the neck, had 8 kids, something about a COVID restriction. I haven't dived into all the details, but that is making such a huge impact in China right now. China is trying to deflect that. They're trying to message around it. So I think that's going to hit them. And I think the other thing that's going to hit them is I think nations are going to have enough of it, like the Australians talk about, right? This they have the Silk Road initiative that they have, but it's also what it is. It's a trap. It's a debt diplomacy trap. They come in and they
Mhm.
lend these countries billions of dollars. Well, these countries can't pay it back, and they know it. It's like predatory lending practices in the United States, which they've outlawed, they've prosecuted, put them in prison for. That's predatory lending. I know you can't do it. So then what happens? I take over your deep water ports, which China needs. I take over this. By the way, here's an interesting thing. China and Russia are just tolerating each other. They're getting along because in the old days of the Soviet Union and the KGB had what they called three uh, main adversaries: the US, NATO, and China. Now, in the
Mhm.
days of, Glasnost, and now we've got just the Russian Federation, their intelligence services, they have what they call three main targets. Guess what those three main targets are?
Mhm. What's that?
US, NATO, and China. Hasn't changed. China
Okay.
is still a target for Russia.
Yeah.
They trust them about as far as they can throw them, but the enemy of my enemy is my friend right now.
Exactly. So that's what's going on. Um, then the other place I wanted to head to, because we didn't get enough time here, obviously we will have to do this again for sure, to speak more on your podcast. You have a podcast in which, actually, as a matter of fact, why don't you just explain what you guys get on in your podcast? Because I was going to ask you some stuff about El Chapo, but we'll have to do all that stuff. I'll come back and you have to tell some stories about all the stuff that you guys have
Well, El Chapo's never
found
getting
out.
out of prison again. I can tell you that. Florence adult
For sure.
administrative. Yeah, he never.
For sure. For
He's
sure.
never getting out of prison
Okay.
again.
Okay.
Anyway, no, it's called Game of Crimes. Total ripoff of Game of
Yeah.
Thrones. Evil is coming instead of winter is coming. But so my partner, if anybody's ever watched Narcos on Netflix, the story about the takedown of Pablo Escobar. Well, one of my partners is Steve Murphy. Boyd Holbrook plays him in the movie. Pedro Pascal plays Javier Pena, who's my other buddy. But Steve and I run a podcast called Game of Crimes. Our one thing that we wanted to change on this, Will, different than the other true crime podcasts, ours is more of a long form. Our podcasts are usually 2 parts. We cover 4 things. Why'd you get into law enforcement? Or why did you get into the business? We've interviewed bad guys. We've interviewed money launderers.
Mm,
We've interviewed
mm,
Pablo's business partner, George Young, that Johnny Depp played in the movie Blow. So we've interviewed people on the other side of the law as well, but we say, why'd you get into it? Let's set context. Remember, I kept talking about context. We just can't talk
sure.
about El Chapo or the takedown of Pablo without setting the context. What was going on? What was the country like, right? Then let's talk about the big story, and then what are you doing now? And so we have gotten, we're up to episode 38 is coming out. And this is actually episode 38 that's coming out this next, or it's 37 that's coming out this next week, is about Tommy Cindric, Eric Stouch, who brought down a guy named Paul LaRue. Basically, if
Okay.
there was a James Bond villain in modern life, it was Paul LaRue. He was a techie, created his own encryption. He was making 9 to 10 million a month just on selling fake pharmaceuticals. Then he got into mercenaries and
Oh,
stuff. So what we do is we tell the real stories behind this, and it's called gameofcrimespodcast.com. We're on all the platforms, but we love it because we get the real stories. We set context. We learn about people's background. In other words, why did you get into law enforcement? So many different stories. Or George, asking George Young, why did you get into
mm,
dope trafficking? Not just the
right.
standard. Tell us, what was Pablo like? That's later. We want to learn about George.
Yeah, yeah.
What drove you? And so it's, for us, it's this behavior thing too. We get a chance to dive deep on these guys and girls. Some of our best
Mm,
episodes are the ladies who talk about, and we've had female officers who have been shot and survived, talk about how they handled that. We've got, one of them was the DEA special agent down in Phoenix. We talked about some of the stuff
mm,
she did working outlaw motorcycle gangs when she was a Phoenix police officer.
mm.
We've just got great stories. The takedown of El Chapo, it's not like you
Yeah.
think it is in the movies, and it doesn't work the way it does in Hollywood, right? But we just have a great time telling stories. It's longer form, so if you're looking for a 30-minute, I just want the high points in and out, then watch MSNBC, or listen to some of the
Yeah.
other podcasts, ours. But if you want to hear the story, and if you want the real story about what happened, like Dave Reichert and his 20-year hunt to find the Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway, killed 49
Mm,
women that we know, or 51 that we know of, and probably a lot
mm.
more. I mean, just these stories are impactful especially when you hear the authentic feelings that, and we have sometimes where there's a gap of 10 seconds to where when the person we're talking to is still emotional about it, we have to give them time. And
Yeah.
tears. I mean, we don't try and make people cry, but these people, when they talk about losing their partner, when they talk about the things they saw, going to 49 crime scenes and seeing dead bodies in various states of composition,
Yeah.
you know? So anyway, that's the reason we love it. It's a passion of ours to tell the story the way it ought to be told and not let Hollywood define it, which we've all dealt with Hollywood. I used to work with the show America's Most Wanted as an advisor for them.
Okay. Remember
TV
that show?
is just
Yeah.
an encapsulation, right? You got to get the real deal.
That's and it's something that we preach all the time across all of the channels that we have. Of course, guys, the world that we live in, and it's not just because of our phones and just because of our computers, but deep thinking, deep analysis, trying to understand the world around you, and listening to things in a long form, but while doing nothing else, while just sitting there and trying to do that, it will change the way that you actually react within the world. I mean, it's amazing what you can learn and what I've learned, and I will go back to this podcast, take the things that you've said and these points and how to question things, what people are looking at, and it will just change you, and it will change you for the better if you seek out stuff like this. So for sure, we're going to have all of the links to the podcast right down below. If you're watching this on YouTube, of course, it's in the description box. If you're listening to this, it's in the show notes. Yes. And so, Morgan, this was awesome. We definitely have to do it again.
Anytime, mate.
Yeah.
Anybody from Kansas, even though you went to Missouri, we called Missouri the state of misery. 8 of the worst weeks of my life were in Fort Lost in the Woods, Missouri.
Yeah. All right. Well, awesome. Listen,
Sir.
thanks again. And guys, we will see you later.